building used to be the Downs Hotel. And it was there that on the 22nd of June, 1870, the Pickwick Bicycle Club was founded. 6 cycling enthusiasts got together, sat there in the hotel and decided to start a cycling association. They chose a name to commemorate Charles Dickens, who had died just a fortnight before that. So it's a reference to his first novel, The Pickwick Papers. And they also all chose themselves nicknames. So they went by various names of Dickens characters in their capacity as club members. There was obviously Samuel Pickwick, who was the president, Sam Weller, Tom Smart, etc. So their activities were many and various. Of course, they went on outings, cycling in London and outside of London. Their favorite places in London were Hampton Court and Ali Pali, Alexander Palace. Then they went to Essex, they went further afield to France, to the Lake District. And they also chose themselves a uniform, which included a straw hat with a ribbon. If you look at one of the old pictures, the photograph that pictures all the founding fathers, they're all wearing like Victorian suits and bowler hats, except for one man who actually does wear the straw hat and the striped top. So if you were to bump into him in Hackney today, you'd just mistake him for a 21st century hipster, because that's what he looks like. So the machines those Victorians rode were very clunky. They had iron tires, wooden spokes, and no springs whatsoever. So uncomfortable they were called bone shakers sometimes. And so when the members of the club were out and about, they always carried whistles to indicate danger, caution, etc. And those were sensible precautions, because cycling was quite new in those days. It was certainly a luxury. It was kind of an exclusive activity for the privileged in the days before mass manufacturing. But it was also seen as something suspicious. Lots of people, not just the public, but also the police, view those strange cyclists with a great deal of suspicion. And of course, there were lots of road rage incidents. The history of the club talks about this really blood-curdling case where a couple of riders were trying to overtake a coach, and the driver was absolutely mad at them, so he weaved across the road. He took to them with his whip, and the coach guard was even worse, because he apparently had a metal ball on the chain which he swung aiming for the bikes, and he managed to knock off one of the riders, who was then dragged along the road. But luckily his friend kept his cool, took down the details of the pair, and they were later fined by magistrates. So whatever we do today, let's just make sure we don't get in any incidents of that nature or any other nature. Our marshals will make sure that we all stay together and stay safe. So before we set off, just one final look at this wonderful building. The Pickwick Bicycle Club turns 155 years old next month. It miraculously still exists, even though they're not as active as they used to be, and they're no longer based in Hackney. But the spirit of urban cycling lives on, and it will guide us on our journey today. So our next stop is Clapton Pond. It's very close, but we'll take a longish scenic route, partly to check out the new cycle lane which goes all the way around Lee Bridge roundabout, and partly to get used to riding as a group, to gauge our speed and to make sure we can all do it comfortably and safely. Started this life as a natural body of water, and then they extended it by making another reservoir. And those picturesque brick buildings across the road are known as Bishop Wood's outhouses. They date back to the middle of the 17th century, when a native of Hackney called Thomas Wood bought the land and built 3 buildings with 10 rooms to house 4 elderly widows there. And when he died at the end of the 17th century, he left a will with provisions in the will for the widows to continue living there, and for whoever came next to be housed there as well. Each widow was also to receive every 2 years a gown with Thomas Wood's initials embroidered on it. So then they added, in the 19th century, they added that chapel, which is believed to be the smallest chapel in Britain. There are only 10 seats, one for each resident. During the Second World War, the government requisitioned the old houses, and then they reopened in 1948 and continued running. The charity continued running them, and then they couldn't afford maintaining the buildings anymore by the beginning of this century, so the residents were moved to a different home in Borough Road, not very far from here. And this was taken over by a developer, and they redeveloped it quite successfully. And next to it, there's another building which I'd like to show you. This is known as Pond House, and it's also Grade 2 listed. One of the finest late Georgian houses in Hackney. It was built in the early 19th century. The architect is unknown, but we don't know who commissioned it. Someone called Benjamin Walsh, who ran an insurance practice in the city. As befits an affluent businessman, he needed a villa within easy reach of the city, but also wanted to give his family a bit of nature-like surroundings. So this place was chosen, and the architect clearly wanted to build something like a country house, but on a smaller scale to fit it into the urban surroundings. So, but just a few years after this was built, it was up for sale. Why? Because Walsh had fallen into debt. He had been entrusted with a huge amount of money and embezzled it all. He was playing the lottery. He had been notorious for somewhat dodgy practices, and eventually he tried to extricate himself by taking up a seat in Parliament, because becoming an MP would give him immunity. That didn't work, and he was put on trial and found guilty at the Old Bailey, which in those days meant the death sentence, but somehow he received King's pardon. So the rest of the history of this house is less scandalous. There was a wooden factory there, and then there was a men's club for people who volunteered in the Hackney Rifle Regiment before the Second World War. And then, no prizes for guessing what happened towards the end of the 20th century and beginning of this. It fell into disrepair, stood there, boarded up for a while, and then in 2008 it was acquired for development, and then they managed to bring it back to life like this. So you would say that we have like a tale of two houses here, one born out of charity and the other born out of greed. So yeah, we talked about this being a little bit of countryside within the inner city, and now we're going to countryside proper, or to nature proper. Our next stop is a nature reserve, which is we are going to go down, not this first road, but the next one off to our left, all the way down, cross Millfields Park. And then I want you to be careful, because we will be turning right. There's a sharpish right turn. We'll have to cross the river. If it's busy there, I suggest we dismount and cross. And if it's not, then we can just navigate that fairly narrow bridge. It has another an official name, of which more in a second. So this is a nature reserve which has a rich industrial history. In the middle of the 19th century, the East London Waterworks Company established Middlesex waterbeds, or filter beds as they sometimes are known here. The idea being to provide clean water to London, to fight cholera epidemics, to improve sanitation, which is a big kind of initiative in those days. So to pump the water up from the River Lee into the beds and then up into the reservoirs, they used a beam engine, which was built in 1858 in Cornwall, and it was called Victoria, as indeed many things were in those days. And there was this miracle of Victorian engineering, the biggest engine of its kind at the time. What we see before us, these blocks of Cornish granite, they used to form the foundation of the Indian house. So the filter beds closed in 1969, and then since the 1980s, this area has been managed as a nature reserve by the Dee Valley Regional Park Authority. So there are rangers and there are volunteers who look after the place, and they just completed an important project which took place over the last 2 years, where they cleared scrubland and restored the wetlands ecosystem around here. Back to these blocks. In 1990, Paul of Hackney, London-based artist, was asked to create this piece of art. So she specializes in site-specific monumental stone sculpture. And she used those old blocks, which used to form the foundation of the engine house, to create what she called Nature's Throne. So Hackney Henge is a popular name, and Nature's Throne is what it's called. So you can see there are things like the river motifs and the sun and the earth. So I think one way to read this piece of art is so industry wants to replace nature, and then nature kind of took its revenge. On which note, let's go back to urban civilization now. We are gonna cycle along the river, cross back. There's another bridge which is probably a bit easier than this one, but if it's visible in this map. Round Chapel, and it's listed and on the Historic England website. It appears as the Clapton Park United Reformed Church. For this is how it actually started its life. In 1871, to house a nonconformist congregation, which had been founded at Hackney earlier in the 19th century. It was one of the many that broke away from the Church of England to do their own thing. It was designed by Henry Fuller, an architect who designed a number of nonconformist churches in the area. And then a few years later, those buildings on the left that we just cycled past were added by another famous architect, James Cubitt. That was a school. The congregation did really well for a couple of decades, and then towards the end of the 19th century, the demographics of the area were changing and people were tending to move out to the suburbs, so the numbers decreased and never recovered. And in the 1990s, the Hackney Historic Buildings Trust took over the main auditorium, and the church kept the old schoolrooms. Now, so the building, when it was first built, much about it was unusual. It's called Round Chapel, but it's actually shaped as a horseshoe. It's Italian style, its size, it's big enough for 1,000 people, but most controversially, the use of iron. So there are pillars inside supporting the roof and the gallery, and they are made of cast iron, which in 1871 was a controversial choice. Many architects disliked it, and bishops saw it as alien, because stone was the traditional material for the building of churches, and iron wasn't really welcome. So some bishops refused to consecrate churches where iron had been used, but this was consecrated all right, and everything was fine. So in the, as I said, in the 1990s, the Hackney Historic Buildings Trust started running this, and they reopened it after some renovations. They reopened it in 1997, and it's used as a performance venue and community space. And the church is still using the old schoolrooms for their projects and to run nursery for local kids. So the rise and fall and revival of this building might be the familiar scenario, a very typical story, but much about it is unusual architecture. And now we are going to move just there, still standing in London, Sutton House. It's nearly 5 centuries old. It's 490 years old, to be more precise, and over this time it's been many different things. So it was built in 1535 by Ralph Sadler, who was a sidekick, an associate of Thomas Cromwell, chief fixer to Henry VIII. And then another family bought it a century later. There was a wealthy silk merchant who was also one of the governors of the East India Company. Now, if we fast forward to the 18th century, they split it into two halves. A solicitor lived in one, and the other part was the girls' school. At some point, there were two schools there, boys and the girls' school. And then at the end of the 19th century, St. John at Hackney Church will be visited next, was running it. They took over the estate and they ran it as a young men's club. So the National Trust bought this in the 1930s, and it still runs it as a museum. There's an original oak panel room there with some wonderful wood carvings. There are pieces of period furniture, and there is one original window which you can't see because it's overlooking the picture. So in the 60s and 70s, they had a trade union for a tenant. In the 80s, the building was squatted, so the squatters ran it as a community space with workshops and music gigs and so on. Eventually, they were evicted, and then they renovated the house and opened it as a museum in 1994. Fun fact, Sutton House, the name is a bit misleading. So they chose that name in 1953 to commemorate the notable resident, Thomas Sutton, who actually lived in the house next door. He lived in this road called Sutton Place. We will be cycling up this road in a minute. But this Sutton Place is a more accurate toponym compared to Sutton House. So before we move on, let's just circle back to the Tudor era and where it all started. So when the writer Hilary Mantel was writing a trilogy about Thomas Cromwell, Wolf Hall, which was subsequently made into a popular TV series, she came to Hackney to visit Sutton House. And she remembered that very vividly. She talked about things that she saw there, and she was particularly impressed with two bricks. The bricks are still there, by the way. So one brick she saw had an imprint of a dog's paw on it. So that's all going back nearly 5th century. And another had a little groove left by a blade of grass. And she remembered that moment as a moment of inspiration, the moment when the past actually came alive, and she knew she was going to be able to write about it. Right, so let's cross at the 27 to replace an old parish church, and we'll see what's left of it in a minute, literally. But the architect was James Spiller, and initially he was commissioned to build an even bigger church, big enough for 3,000 people, and this has capacity of 2,000. So in the late 18th century, Hackney was a very desirable location, and the population was still growing. We were talking about its proximity to the city and its relatively unspoiled character, and it was a much nicer place to live compared to lots of other areas in East London. So a bigger church was definitely a must. So in the 20th century, once again, it was in need of repair, and they started a major project in 1954. The completion was scheduled for the 19th of May 1955. On the 18th of May 1955, note the date, a fire broke out in the roof space where workmen's tools were left. That proved quite devastating. So it destroyed the roof, some of the pews, and the 18th century organ inside. So then it took them another year to deal with all that and reopen the church. So here we are today, 70 years to the day after that fire, and it's good to see this building in such a good shape. There's always been a strong musical tradition here. They used to appoint organ players, and there were some really strict rules. They were given instructions as to what to play and how. And now it continues in a more popular vein. So the bands that have played here include Florence and the Machine and Coldplay. They played Radio 1 gig here in 2015. And another performative aspect of this church is its 10 bells. They are rung by an enthusiastic band of ringers every Sunday. But to discover the history of those bells and how they came to be here, we need to move just a couple of hundred yards down that way towards St. Augustine's Tower. It might be a bit busy with pedestrians and also uneven, so we need to dismount. So this is St. Augustine's Tower, the oldest structure in Hackney. It was part of that old parish church we talked about earlier, and it was built in the late 13th century. So when the new church was built, the plan had always been to demolish the old one, which they did except for the tower. So why did they keep it? What saved it were the bells. Initially, St. John and Hackney did not have a belfry, but they planned to build it, and they decided to keep the tower just for somewhere to house the bell temporarily. By 1814, the steeple was built there, and but then they realized that they couldn't actually move the bells from here to the new building because they were too heavy. But they miscalculated, and the steeple that they built wasn't sturdy enough. So then they said, okay, let's keep it for a bit longer and do something with that. It took them another 40 years to actually bring that steeple to state where it was able to house the bells. So in 1854, they were finally ready to move the bells, which they did. But by that point, all things medieval were in fashion in Victorian Britain. It was absolutely inconceivable to knock down something like this. So that they kind of bought themselves a bit of time by being slow and inefficient, but that eventually saved this tower. So it was bought by Hackney Council in 1929, and they made some repairs to it, and the Hackney Historic Buildings Trust is looking after this tower. Before we move on, a couple of words about the turret clock. We can see one face of it, one of its two faces here, just about. So the mechanism that's still there is pretty much the original mechanism, give or take some parts. And it dates back to the late 16th or possibly early 17th century. So it's one of very few left of that kind in the world. And of course there are later additions. The clock faces, this one and the one on opposite side were added later. And another thing which was added later is the winding mechanism. Amazingly, for more than 400 years they used to wind it up by hand until 2006, when they finally installed an electric device and automated the process. So this is open to the public every last Sunday of the month. If you come there on one of those days, then you'll be able to see a single bell. There's a bell up there, and you can even ring it. And if you go all the way up to the top, the view is absolutely breathtaking.
So you can ring the bell yourself? Did you say you can ring the bell yourself?
Yep. Yeah, there's like a little hammer. Yeah,
cool.
And the bell is at the best of times. The bell is actually it chimes the hour, but it doesn't now because there's some mechanical fault. I was here a couple of weeks ago and talked to the volunteers who look after it. So they are now looking for a specialist who can work with that ancient mechanism and connect the bell back to it so that it starts chiming the hour again. We're not going to be able to hear it today unless they were super efficient, but yeah, eventually they will repair it.
The original church, did it come up this way or which way was
Yeah, this way.
I think
Yeah.
it was
it? So that wall would have been internal at one stage.
Some of these tombs were inside the church.
Yeah, I think this is all from the church.
I think this wall here, I think marks the boundaries. There's a
That wall would have been,
Inside
the
the
bottom
church.
would have been joining to the rest
Yeah.
of the church.
There's a plan on that board of the church.
Things we have seen today and will see later in our tour has lived several different lives over the last century and a quarter. It was built in 1901. The architect is Frank Matcham, a famous theatre architect. And it opened as a theatre and music hall. The repertoire was quite varied. They had musical entertainment and panto and comedy sketches. And it was a state-of-the-art modern building for those days. There was electric lights everywhere, an internal bathroom system, and a sliding roof, which was used for ventilation. And then in the 1910s, they started showing films there. So in its incarnation as a music hall, the Hackney Empire saw such stars as Charlie Chaplin, Stan Laurel, Houdini, Louis Armstrong perform on its stage. Then in the 20th century, there were all sorts of different things happening to it. In 1956, it was bought by a TV company and they used it as a broadcasting studio. Then in 1962, Mecca came over and took over, and then they ran it as a bingo hall, which wasn't the best period for the building. In fact, things were so bad that by the 80s, it was decided to knock it down, and they thought they'd just build a car park here. Luckily, a theatre company called Cuts, founded and led by Roland and Claire Muldoon, put up a campaign and raised some money and then managed to preserve the building and keep it as their base. In the 90s, it was the place to see alternative comedy. People like Ben Elton and Don French started their careers there. And the most recent dramatic change in the life of this building was at the turn of the century. In 2001, they closed it for 3 years for a major renovation project. The funding for which came from the public coffers and also from private donors, one of whom was Alan Sugar. So he had grown up in Hackney and used to be brought here as a child by his parents and had fond memories of the place. So that project was a success. In 2004, they reopened and there was a gala concert headlined by Brian May. And now it's, again, the repertoire there is quite varied. There is opera, there are musicals and comedy gigs. In 2023, the Rolling Stones launched their latest album, Hackney Diamonds, here. I was passing by and seeing the Rio Cinema. I kept thinking of Mick Jagger taking the overground from Richmond, where he famously lives, and traveling all along London, all across London, to get to Hackney Central. So yeah, a century and a quarter old, this building has been and done various things, but it doesn't just welcome big stars. It also supports aspiring artists. There is a program called Creative Futures, which has been running for 20 years, and that supports young people who want to become performers, musicians, entrepreneurs. So they provide training and equipment to them. And so if we look at this sculpture, Warm Shores, it was unveiled in 2022 to commemorate the Windrush generation. I think it's heartening to think that the descendants of despair are now able to pursue their dreams, and the theatre which has come to symbolize renewal. So our next leg is probably the longest. In 2001, a sinkhole opened in this road where we're standing now, and if you look down it, you could see a maze of tunnels and some bizarre sculptures scattered here and there. And that was the beginning of a long and painful process that culminated in Hackney Council evicting the owner of 121 Mortimer Road, a man called William Little. It was Little who had dug those tunnels under his own house and on the street here. He did it single-handedly using just one spade and a DIY pulley. And he did it in secret. He had tenants, and not even the tenants knew the project. And when the scale of it became evident, so the tunnels were 8 meters deep.
8 meters down.
And 20 meters wide along the children.
8
Look at
meters
it.
deep,
So
that's very deep.
when that became exposed, the story was all over the press. Journalists came to talk to Little, and well, they were mainly interested to find out why he did it, but he wasn't very forthcoming. He would say things. His favorite explanation was, I want to build a wine cellar, and then I got carried away. And then when the Guardian talked to him, he said, you know what, people always ask you, what's the big secret, and there isn't one. So he had come here in the 1960s from Ireland, having inherited the house. And he was absolutely dead against moving out, but the council managed to evict him by 2006, and he was recast. They put him in a flat in Hackney, where he died in 2010. So then they tried to trace any descendants unsuccessfully, and in 2012 the house was auctioned. It was bought by Sue Webster and Tim Noble, a pair of artists who I think it would have probably been easier to knock it down, but they decided to preserve the facade and salvage what they could of Littl's artwork. So yeah, the story just their renovation work was some designer works and locals apparently approached us in the street and thanked her for saving this slice of Hackney history. So the story keeps resurfacing in the media. Just last year there was a long read in the Financial Times recapping all the details. So I think it's people find it fascinating because it's got everything in it, things like destruction, gentrification, local politics, arts, all those things that make Hackney what it is. So from the Mole Man's house or the Mole house, whichever way you prefer to call it, will be moving. The house was established by the English dissenters in 1708. Again, there was a non-conformist congregation, one of the earliest in London and currently the oldest still in use as a chapel. And so Newton Green was full of radicals and it was only natural for it to have its own chapel. And historical figures associated with this place are too many to mention, but we'll just focus on one who is perhaps now the most famous former member of the congregation, Mary Wollstonecraft. She came here as a young woman, as a young schoolmistress in 1784. So she used to have a girls' school in Islington, and then she moved it to Newton Green. It was just across the park. And she joined the congregation and spent here a few years, and those were formative years for her. She then left and became a writer, and she wrote what remains her most famous work, a political pamphlet titled Vindication of the Rights of Women. So Wollstonecraft saw parallels between dissenters and women. So both were marginalized groups. They were partially excluded from education and they were denied civil rights. And she wrote about that and mostly about the importance of education for young women and women in general. So we now see her as a proto-feminist or an early feminist. And in 2009, it was her 250th anniversary. It was widely marked, and she has since become something of an iconic figure. And a portrait of her first appeared here on this wall in 2013. An artist called Stewie, who specializes in stencil portraits of historical figures associated with certain locations, came here and painted this. Not this, but an identical portrait. And then it became very popular, and the chapel, the Meeting House used it as their logo pretty much. And then a few years ago, they were renovating and they painted this wall, painted over the mural. And 3 years ago, I looked Stewie up online. I haven't met him, and I emailed him saying, do you have any plans to restore the mural? And surprisingly, he replied within minutes saying, actually, yes, I'm coming to the area next week. So we met here 3 years ago, and he brought his original stencil from the location. So first we went across and had a look at that sculpture we just cycled past. That's a tribute to Mary Wollstonecraft by the sculptor Maggie Hamblin. And then we came here and he used his stencil. He took out the kind of spray paint and then painted the bottom half, then the top half, and then his signature as I watched. And it only took him 3 minutes. So, he talked to me about how he had researched that, and he looked at an existing portrait of Wollstonecraft, but also talked to historians about like how tall she would have been and what she would have worn, etc. But he also said that he likes imagining her just passing by, walking here, passing by this very spot. And he likes to think that her spirit lives on. Of course, it does in these tributes to her, but most importantly, in the evolution of feminism, which is a movement started 200 years ago and still very much work in progress. So a very short ride up the road and then left into a cyclewoman, an auctioneer, converted her warehouse into what she called the Kingsland Palace of Animated Pictures. And then a few years later, in 1913, she commissioned an architect, George Coles, she bought two properties on either side and commissioned an architect to knock them together and build a theatre. So that was called the Kingsland Empire. And Solotsky owned it for a couple of decades, and then in the 30s she sold it and became part of the classic cinema chain. And in 1936, another architect was brought into the picture, F.E. Bromwich, and he was the one who created this Art Deco facade, which is quite striking. And he also rebuilt the auditorium. But what he did was something quite interesting. So he kept, those of you who have been know that the auditorium is also quite modernist, very Art Deco. But he left the old auditorium as it was and then slotted this new one inside it. So there are two auditoriums, one nested inside the other. If you climb up to the roof spaces, as I once did, you can see the old ceiling all covered in soot. So it's like a shell inside another shell. In the 70s, the Rio became a members club, as many cinemas did in those days, to circumvent censorship. And they made some unorthodox programming choices. They showed blue movies, they had live exotic striptease shows on the stage, they had young women going up and down the streets selling tickets. Just a random look at a random program from 1984 shows that they were, one week they were showing two films simultaneously. So the bill had the main feature, which was Police Academy, one of the biggest Hollywood releases of that year. And they also showed Police in London, which was a short about the Metropolitan Police commissioned by the Greater London Council. And the distributors of the comedy weren't very happy, not for any political reasons, but they just said they're from different sources and you shouldn't be doing that. So that's something that independent cinemas have to deal with very often. They can't survive without the blockbusters, but the distributors impose their own draconian laws. Nevertheless, Rio has survived as an independent community cinema. It's a charity run as a not-for-profit charity, and they do, of course, show the latest releases, but they also have some interesting programming solutions. They run film festivals. There was a Kurdish festival last month. LGBT-themed films are an interesting addition to their program. They have late-night screenings and so on. So in the 1930s, Hackney had 24 picture houses, and then the advent of TV and then video and internet closed down all of them except for this one. So this is the only survivor. And they got a grant from the Mayor of London in 2017 and did some long overdue repairs to the building. They built a second screen in the basement. It's a popular venue for kids' parties. So it remains here. It's one of the symbols of Hackney, a place where entertainment has always been serious business. That's our destination. This mural was painted in 1985. It was designed by Ray Walker, an artist, a well-established muralist, in 1983. Unfortunately, he didn't live to complete his project because the next year, in 1984, he suddenly died, aged only 39. So a friend of the artist, Mike Jones, and his widow, Anna Walker, completed it with him and painted the mural in 1985. It was funded by Hackney Council and the Greater London Council, and it was part of the Peace Year, an initiative run by the GLC. So we are talking about the mid-80s when the threat of a nuclear war was in the air. And looking at the mural, you can see there's a lot going on, and the subject is clearly a peace demonstration. There are CND and Greenpeace banners there. It's It's interesting. I find it really fascinating to try and decipher as many details as you can. So there's a railway worker up there. There's a miner. There's a saxophonist, and those who remember the days when it was being designed and painted say that many characters in this mural are based on real people, shown as models. And also there are historical figures joining them. There's Mahatma Gandhi up there in the top left corner looking out of the window. On the right there's Nelson Mandela. And the artist, Ray Walker, who designed it, is also commemorated. His face is on the far left against the billowing rainbow flag. And the woman in the bottom right corner is Anna Walker, who painted it. And the boy just above her is their son. So when I think about the future of Hackney, this is how I often imagine it. It's a buzzy and busy place, multicultural, multicolored, a place where art takes the form of protest and vice versa. And there are no cyclists in this mural, but here we are now, and that makes us part of this community. As we have seen today on our tour, Hackney keeps reimagining, reinventing itself, moving very fast, and I think the best way to keep pace with it is to keep riding our bikes. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for Miranda and Kylie for marshalling. I hope you'll enjoy it.